This is screen capture video unit 8. It's the first video of this unit, and it covers cellular respiration. Cellular respiration would be the chemical activities, the metabolism. When we think of biochemicals that are used, broken down, transformed into other chemicals for energy use. Specifically, it's usually an organic chemical such as a carbohydrate or a fat, lipid, and even proteins. And those are broken down, and the energy that's in those chemicals is used to make ATP. Oftentimes, ATP is described as the energy currency of the cell. And all cells, as far as we know, and we're taught, from bacteria up through humans, produce ATP. And so we look at the mechanisms whereby cells produce ATP. One of the big areas that we study, and this is what we do primarily to survive from instant to instant, is aerobic respiration. This is a type of cellular respiration, and it involves breaking down a glucose molecule with the help of oxygen. And from a biochemistry standpoint, it's being oxidized. The glucose is being oxidized with the use of oxygen. This is the oxygen that we breathe. The glucose will be taken in by what we consume through our mouth, usually. And we produce the products, carbon dioxide, which would be relatively low energy, water, which would be relatively low energy, and the byproduct of energy in the form of ATP. A lot of energy in the glucose molecule, and that's oxidized with the help of oxygen. These are the chemicals that go into the reaction, and the products are the carbon dioxide, water, and then of course energy. And if we remember the laws of thermodynamics, we neither create nor destroy matter nor energy. So whatever is on the left hand side of the arrow, or we can think of it as an equal sign, has to equal what's on the right hand side. So whatever energy was in the glucose molecule, it would need to be accounted for on the right side. And whatever atoms are on the left-hand side need to be accounted for on the right-hand side. Whatever's on the left hand, accounted for on the right hand. The glucose molecule is often written C6H12O6. It's a common chemical that's discussed in biology. It's one that you should be familiar with when you see it. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. The atmospheric oxygen, how oxygen is usually found in most cases, will be O2. It's 2 atoms joined together, diatomic molecule. It takes 6 of those molecules to join up with carbon dioxide to break it down properly. What would be released would be 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, that's the CO2, and 6 molecules of water. And this is the net equation. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but as far as we're concerned, this is what happens with the atoms and the molecules. Energy would be released in 2 forms, heat energy and ATP. We're mostly concerned about the ATP, but to account for all the energy that was in the original glucose molecule, we would need to consider that some energy is given off as heat, actually quite a bit of it. And when I say quite a bit, a majority of the energy that was in the glucose molecule is lost as heat energy. In the winter months, that feels good because we need to produce that heat in excess to keep our bodies warm. We need to produce some heat in the summer, but not as great a need as what we have in the winter. And most of the energy that's in that glucose molecule goes to produce heat. A minority of it, approximately 40%, goes to produce ATP. That ATP helps get work done around the cells, such as moving molecules around in the cell, moving cells around, moving flagella, moving things across the plasma membrane, moving chromosomes around, and so on. In some cases, you have organisms that can produce light. Some of the bacteria do that. Fireflies, which are actually a beetle, will produce light. They're bioluminescent. That requires ATP. And I might add, when you're driving down the road or the highway on a warm day, especially in the evening, and you hit a firefly and that beetle, what you notice is that it will glow for a while on your windshield. And that's because there's still ATP present. When the ATP is used up, then that light dies down, so to speak. It decreases and you don't see it anymore. But just because the beetle's dead doesn't mean the ATP has disappeared. It just takes a while for it to be used up. In humans, it's said that we have about a 7 to 10 minute supply of ATP at any given time. We're constantly producing it, constantly breaking it down. We don't store it. It's not a great storage molecule. And that's one of the reasons why rigor mortis can set up so quickly after death. I may touch on that in a little bit. So we look at the equation, and what we see is what I have written above. This is for aerobic respiration. Glucose goes in, 1 molecule of glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen go in. We take that in by breathing it, and we exhale eventually 6 carbon molecules from that 1 glucose, 6 water molecules, and these water molecules, some of those are breathed out. We exhale on average about 2 liters of water per day, and then some would be excreted in perspiration and urine. And we make a certain amount of ATPs. We represent that as a type of energy, because we're taking energy that's bound in the molecule of glucose, in the bonds between the hydrogens and the carbons, breaking those, and that energy goes to form ATPs from ADP and AMP. These images are mostly from the text, and I didn't necessarily go out on the internet to find these, though you might be able to find them out on the internet. If you burn glucose, and it is possible to burn it, it's a carbohydrate, all of the energy is converted to heat and light. And we can say 100% because we're including heat here. If you take a person and what they are burning as far as glucose oxidizing in their cells, which is a more controlled burn than burning with a flame, about 40% of the energy that's in the glucose actually goes to produce ATP. And that's a whole lot better than vehicles, whether it's gasoline or diesel. Only about 25% of the energy that's in the gasoline actually moves the vehicle down the road. There's a lot of energy that's lost as heat, not just from the engine, but also in the axles and braking and other things. So only 1/4 the energy that's in the gasoline actually goes to move the vehicle down the road on average. Not very efficient. You hear me use the term oxidation. Oxidation refers to burning. So when you oxidize something, generally you're burning it. It's not always a burn as we think of as a burn, but that's what is happening. We're burning energy in our cells. When I say energy, we're burning high energy molecules such as carbohydrates and lipids in our cells and gaining energy from that. Reduction, it would be pretty much the opposite. That's where a molecule or atom gains energy. It's actually gaining electrons. And one might say, why is it called reduction if you're gaining electrons? Because even though you're gaining electrons and gaining energy, an electron's charge is negative, and if you're keeping track of charges, something that's more negative you think of as being reduced in charge, and so that's how it gets its name, reduced, even though it typically gains energy when it's more reduced. Something that is oxidized loses energy. If you take a log or paper, you burn it, the ashes that are a result have less energy than the original paper or log. When we talk about aerobic respiration, it starts with a set of reactions called glycolysis, and I've broken this down into the simplest terms. You can read this in a text, and there's a lot more information to try to assimilate, but I've broken it down into the main components. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol. No special organelles are required. Just out in the watery portion of the cell, no oxygen is required. Some scientists incorrectly describe glycolysis as anaerobic respiration. That is incorrect. Anaerobic respiration is something completely different. But it can occur anaerobically. It does not require oxygen. It can occur in the presence of oxygen or in the absence of oxygen. Enzymes are required. I don't name all those enzymes, but if you're doing a thesis on aerobic respiration or some part of it, you'd want to know those enzymes. That would become important, but for what we're doing, it's not. The glucose molecule is a 6-carbon molecule. It's broken down eventually in the process of glycolysis and those reactions into 2 3-carbon molecules. And again, keep track of those atoms. If you start out with 6 atoms, you have to account for 6 atoms at the end. Those 3-carbon molecules, and there are 2 of them, are called pyruvates or pyruvic acid, depending on who you go by. The process of glycolysis will have a net production of 2 ATPs, and those ATPs are produced by what's called substrate level phosphorylation. Remember, phosphorylation can be the forming of ATP or the breakdown of ATP, putting phosphate groups on or taking them off. Here we're talking about putting them on. And it's substrate level because the ATPs are formed from the direct breakdown of the glucose molecule, the 6-carbon molecule. And the glucose is the substrate. So it's broken down from the direct breakdown, the energy that's released, 2 ATPs can be formed. Therefore, it's called substrate level phosphorylation. Different than chemiosmotic phosphorylation we'll talk about in a little bit. Also, 2 NADHs are produced in glycolysis. So a net amount of 2 ATPs and 2 NADHs. NADH is a high energy molecule, actually has more energy than ATP. So here's a schematic of, or an overview of what's going on with the cellular respiration. I think I can fit it all in here, and I want to do that so you can see everything. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller. This is representing the inside of a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. This grayish, bluish structure represents a mitochondrion. And so they're showing where reactions occur relative to the mitochondrion. As I mentioned, glycolysis occurs out in the watery portion of the cytoplasm. It does not require a membrane-bound organelle. A little bit of ATP is produced from it. Also NADH. And notice the NADH will eventually move into the mitochondrion and be put into the electron transport chain, and chemiosmosis will occur. The 2 pyruvic acids have to be prepped and become acetyl coenzyme A and they move into the mitochondrion, into the matrix, what we call the matrix of the mitochondrion, where they'll eventually go into the Krebs cycle and be further processed. More NADHs and FADHs will be produced. A little bit of ATP will be produced. And all those NADHs and FADHs then go into the electron transport chain, where chemiosmosis occurs. And that's where most of the ATPs are produced. So it's a little bit subtle, but these ATPs in the little starburst represent lesser amounts of ATP. The bigger starburst, more ATP. And this is where most of the ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is produced in the cell, in the electron transport chain. That's important to remember. Here we have an illustration of a mitochondrion. They're not always cigar-shaped or watermelon-shaped. They can be round, and they can change their shape. I've seen video footage of them changing their shape. Over on the left here you have the cell, and they show a couple of mitochondria in the cell. Things to note with the mitochondrion: there's an outer membrane. We learned this earlier in Biology 101 in one of the earlier units. Besides the outer membrane, there's an inner membrane. And there are places where the inner membrane has infoldings, and that increases the surface area where more chemical reactions can occur. Those infoldings are called cristae. Individually, called crista. So this is a crista, this is a crista. And then the watery portion inside the mitochondrion is called the matrix. You wouldn't necessarily know it, but they have it labeled here. Mitochondria have their own DNA. It's called mitochondrial DNA. And they're little grainy things, structures. Those are ribosomes. And mitochondria have their own ribosomes. They're smaller, not as complex as the cellular ribosomes. I'll continue in the next video.